Welcome to Dialing In Your Coffee Business, where we help cafe and roastery owners build a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people, including them. I'm Michael Ryan. I'm a certified business coach and consultant that helps cafe and roastery owners build a healthy, profitable coffee business that takes great care of all of the people, including the owners. On today's episode, I'm joined by Maxwell Mooney. We recorded this episode before Maxwell took his job with Onyx Coffee Lab. We talk about overhead, controlling overhead. Specifically, we dive into actionable tools for managing labor and managing rent. But we look at these through the lens of thinking of your business like an airplane. And that helps keep the focus on where we think the focus should be, which is on safely transporting people from point A to point B. Anytime the topic of labor or rent or overhead comes up, people often assume we mean we're going to throw people off the airplane to make things work. That is absolutely not what we mean. And this is why we think that it's so helpful to think of your business like an airplane. You would never run a business of transporting people on an airplane by regularly throwing people off the plane. But we do need to keep the overhead, the labor, and the rent under control and specifically in proportion to the other parts of the business. Otherwise, you can get overhead that is bloated and it ultimately crashes the plane. We know you'll find this episode extremely helpful, extremely useful, with actionable tips for controlling and managing the overhead, labor, and rent so that you can continuously and sustainably take great care of all the people, including you. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this podcast is an extension of our coaching and consulting. It's a part of our effort to make all of the tools necessary to build a healthy coffee business zero cost to everyone. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank one of today's sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by our How to Grow a Roastery online course. The internet and social media are filled with people trying to help you roast your coffee better and better, but there is almost nothing available to help you run the business side of your roastery better and better. Whether you also own cafes or not, this online on-demand course will guide you through step-by-step everything you need to know to grow your roastery into a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people. You can access this course and all of our other on-demand courses at threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com/courses. And be sure to enter the code podcast100 at checkout to get $100 off any of our online on-demand courses. That's threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com/courses and enter the code podcast100, all caps, to get $100 off any of our online courses. And now my conversation with Maxwell Mooney. All right, y'all, welcome back. We are continuing our tour around this analogy of your business like an airplane. And today we're talking about the body of the airplane. And this is where it gets really, really good. There are so many correlations. Of course, every analogy breaks down at a certain point, but there are so many helpful ways of thinking about a healthy coffee business embedded in this specific part of the analogy. And so I'm super excited to talk about the body of the airplane, which is the overhead and the labor of the business. I think one of the most helpful parts of this analogy, this mental model, this way of thinking about a business is that it keeps the focus on what I think should be the focus, which is the people. And the original purpose of the airplane is to take people safely and comfortably, whenever possible, from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. And whenever we talk about profitable products in demand, sales, marketing, I think I told you, Maxwell, in a conversation offline that I had posted something about labor on social media, and somebody said something like, "Oh, you'd be much better suited to be an a-hole CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. That sort of draconian approach to business doesn't fly in 2023." And I was like, that whole assumption of what I meant when I said that is based on an underlying assumption, a mental model that doesn't really match what I was talking about. When we talk about a healthy business that takes good care of people, I'm thinking about an airplane that has an appropriately proportioned body that can safely carry a certain number of people. And there is a limit to how many people, how much weight, we'll say, a plane can safely carry. And to be willing to make some of those hard decisions is one of the hardest parts about being a coffee business owner. So overhead in general, the amount of weight the plane can safely carry is kind of what we're talking about. But there's at least two things, and maybe as we're talking, a third one will kind of surface, but there's at least two things that tend to be worth looking at when we're talking about overhead in general. And that's labor and rent for a space. Mm-hmm. Those are the two parts of overhead that I have personally seen kind of crash the plane, so to speak, is when those two things are not kept in check. Maxwell, what's been your experience as far as overhead goes with labor and rent? And is there anything else that you see consistently crashing businesses from an overhead perspective that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the two biggest ones, assuming that they're, what we talked about last episode with their prices, are they fair?
Yeah.
I think that's another thing that I see tank people a lot of times is that, like they are not willing to try to raise prices because it feels bad, or any of the number of reasons. They have that emotional anchoring, those kinds of things, and so it's just impossible to keep up. But generally speaking, other than that, it's almost always labor and rent. Or labor or rent sometimes, or labor and rent together, or sometimes just rent. But usually, if it's rent, it's because of a number of other factors. But,
Yeah, you just did an amazing cohort for our small group coaching on how to. No, I'm serious. I've sat through, I don't know how many, lectures, presentations, podcast episodes on lease negotiation and site selection, and your take on it was was the best I've ever heard, specifically when it came to lease negotiation and site selection. And really part of that is rent. So let's actually start there, because ultimately I'd like to spend the bulk of our time on labor, because that's really near and dear to my heart. I would not particularly say I'm passionate about rent.
Yeah.
But I am passionate about labor.
Yeah. My passions about rent are to pay it as little of it as possible, but such is life.
Yeah, for sure. So when people are entering, one of the things I've heard you say is that if we're not careful, we can create what you call a structural deficit in the business, where it's like, it's almost like baked in, and high rent, unnecessarily high rent, can be a version of a structural deficit, where it's like you're locked in to something that is slowly or quickly crashing the plane. So how can people avoid this? What can they do if they're in this? Hopefully, especially this type of information, you're catching this before you sign your lease, or I'm hoping if you already have a lease, you're like coming up to the end of your terms. Otherwise, this could be really discouraging. But if somebody is in that position where they haven't locked in, or they're about to renegotiate, what are the things that they should be looking for so that they don't accidentally crash the plane with their lease negotiation and their rent in particular?
Yeah. So the biggest thing with rent, and this can also mean mortgage, by the way,
100%.
This just means, money that you're paying for the site that you're at.
Yep.
But the biggest thing is to think about the overall kind of revenue picture that we're looking at. Our target for rent generally is to keep it at 10% or less, all in. When I say all in, I mean, your base rent plus any triple net that you have, but also like the cost for just the infrastructure. In terms of the cafe. If you build a cafe in there and you're paying a loan on that, you want to factor that in as part of your rent. So keeping that at 10% or less, is really essential. And so when you're evaluating a site, really a lot of the work that goes into it is just determining, like, can I get my revenue to match what I need to do, like, for this rent? So if my rent is $3,000, I need to be able to bring in at least $30,000 worth of revenue. Yep. How likely is that, or how possible is that? And one of the things that we, in our cohort, we spend a lot of time talking about is how to evaluate spaces and just markets in general, and just, come up and figure out, like, hedging your bets, basically, of like, I'm more sure that I can do this here than not. So let's go for it. But that's the biggest thing that's going to be necessary. Cause it's like, if you are in an area and you only think you're going to be able to bring in $70,000 a month, but the rent is $12,000, not worth it. Right. Yep. Like nothing is going to help you get past that ever. It's like you're always going to be stuck kind of within that, and you're always going to have this extra cost, which means that in order for you to make up for it, you're going to have a even higher margin on your cost of goods sold and be even more efficient with your labor, both of which are very challenging things to do when you have other people in your area that are already, you're already competing with, especially when you think about the fact that generally speaking, most real estate goes up over time, and a lot of places that are currently established locked in their rates before. And so it's like, they're going to have lower rent than you because they've been there longer. And that's one of the benefits of having that. But that means that they also have lower costs, so they don't have to charge as much, so they can be cheaper than you. So it's just like, it's just a really hard thing to overcome. So
that's such a good point. And it's one of the reasons why, leading with market analysis or only doing market analysis for your pricing can be problematic, because you are not looking at the whole, you can't see their financials like holistically. All you can see is the price that they're charging. But yeah, what if they locked into a super low rate rent wise, and so they're able to make those prices work? Yeah, that's such a good perspective. It strikes me as an interesting differentiation to look at rent or mortgage through the lens of percent of sales instead of price per square foot. I have versions of that conversation a lot where people, we hop on a free strategy call and they want to know X number of dollars per square foot. Is that good? And I struggle with that question. I'm not saying that's an unimportant piece of information, but I find it to be tremendously much more helpful to think about rent in terms of percentage of sales, or at least potential sales. Yeah. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah. I mean, yes and no. Price per square foot matters a lot in negotiations with the landlord, because that's helping determine what the overall, how that particular location sits within the market at large. That doesn't have any bearing on you on whether or not you should take it per se or not, whether it's viable or not. It's like, I mean, it does have some bearing in the sense that if you could get it for cheaper somewhere else that's a comparable location, then great. But it's like, the reality is that coffee businesses, particularly, let's just focus on coffee shops, we have to compete with restaurants, right? With, like, we have way more infrastructure than the average business. It's like tons of plumbing, tons of electrical, tons of cabinetry work, all that kind of thing. And then coffee businesses are already at a bit of a disadvantage in the sense that most of our customers will come and they'll buy a $6 latte and they'll sit for 3 hours or 4 hours and take up the same amount of space. But a restaurant, like, that same person will come in, they'll spend $50, $60 and they'll sit there for an hour and then they're out. So it's like we're functionally in the same rental market as that, right? So it's like you have to really price per square foot matters in that, but you also have to make sure that it will work for a coffee shop, because that landlord might be able to get that price from a restaurant totally fine. And what that just means is that you'd have to pass on it, even though it's a great spot, it's a great location, someone's going to do well. It's like, well, it might not work for a coffee shop because it's in the landlord's best interest to go with someone else who will pay more, and they're going to be able to pull that off more. And so maybe you'll have to pass on that. Or you could talk with the landlord and say, like, hey, here's what I'm projecting for this location based on what I know. I'm trying to keep it under 10% because this is the industry standard. Here's some resources to show that. Like 10% all in, right? Like, and then you can bring that to the negotiation table and say, like, hey, like, here's what I'm looking at. Here's why I don't think this will work for a coffee space. It's like maybe someone would try it, but especially if you have experience as an operator, that's really helpful, because then you're like, I know what I'm doing, and I'm telling you this won't work for my context. And maybe they'll lower the price because they want a coffee shop in there really bad. Or something like that. And there's reasons why landlords might. It's like a lot of times coffee shops are a really great amenity for people who live in a building, and so they're willing to treat your location as a bit of a loss leader if it means being able to produce better residential rents for the people that live there. Stuff like that. So that's all part of the equation.
Yeah, that's great perspective. I was talking with somebody on a free strategy call, and they really want to open up a cafe. if I remember correctly, this particular person was in Denver, and they were saying they were looking at a particular place, and just over and over again, they kept saying, yeah, I really want to do this, but the numbers just don't work. I really want to do this. The numbers just don't work. And then they're like, so I guess I just have to kind of bite the bullet and go for it. And I was like, no, that is the wrong lesson to learn from this experience. That's the wrong takeaway. The numbers are not working out. Wait until the numbers work out. Don't just pull the trigger. Don't just jump in. How does somebody go to work finding out price per square foot amounts that are reasonable for their area? Because it's going to be different in Denver versus Manhattan versus Portland, Oregon, whatever.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why I struggle with that conversation is because I'm not up to speed on every single locale in the entire country. And so when people offhandedly ask me that, I don't have a number in my back pocket. Where can they go to get a sense of those numbers for their particular situation?
Yeah. I mean, generally the way that any deal, any business transaction, or anything is sold or bought happens is the price on which other things sell. So getting comps or comparable sales is usually the way that markets are sort of like determined on what's fair. So, a lot of times the way to do that is to evaluate other locations that are similar square footage, similar amenities, and what those sold for. So those are called comps. You can get those from a realtor. Oftentimes commercial realtors don't charge you any money. Usually the way that they end up getting paid is when the lease gets signed and you paid your first rent check. They get paid from the landlord, oftentimes. So don't be afraid to talk to a commercial realtor. They can be very helpful. So that's one way to do that. And that the price per square foot conversation is really helpful in evaluating how good a deal is for a location, right? In terms of the overall market, but it's not always a good indicator of whether or not it will be viable for you as a business to be in there. Because it's like you could have the most expensive price per square foot location on, ever, but if it's cranking through, like, let's say it costs 10 times more than an average location, but you're putting through 150 times more than the average throughput, that's a good deal. Right? Like that's still a good deal for you, even though the landlord made a lot more money off of you than they would if they were owned another piece of thing. That doesn't really matter if it yields results for you. So that's really the bigger question is what's the investment potential here for you? Right? And that's the question that we are asking people is not like how good of a deal is this particular piece of property, but how likely is it to help you be successful as a good investment? That's usually where we approach this question from.
100%. Yeah. Out of context, it can be a difficult number to get too firm of a grasp on. I've talked to people who have really tiny spots in like beachfront locales, but they got obsessed with the price per square foot, which was super high. But it was the tiniest little postage stamp place also, but because it was so small, labor was almost impossible to overdo because you just couldn't fit more than two people behind the bar because the space was so small and the throughput was through the roof, especially seasonality wise. It was more tourist heavy, so more in the summer. It's a beachfront location, but the owners in that context got too attached to the price per square foot without looking at even just like the total rent, which wasn't that much, but also the total. The percentage in relationship to the sales, especially, an entire calendar year of sales, because it was heavier in one part of the year versus another part of the year. So it's looking at all these things through the different lenses to get the whole picture instead of getting fixated on just one particular number. I think is really, really powerful. That's why I brought up the price per square foot. That's the one that I feel like I hear people get almost fixated on. Totally. When it's not the only number we should be looking at. So I appreciate your perspective on that and getting comps from commercial real estate. I have heard, commercial realtor, excuse me. I have heard people say when we come to this particular conversation, I have heard people say, just don't forget who the commercial realtor actually works for. Totally. And that resonates with me, but I'm curious to hear your perspective. on, we're not saying they're bad people, but that observation you made about like, well, who actually pays their paycheck
Totally.
most of the time, and just not losing sight of that.
Yep. Always. Yeah, that's why, you should always go in with a grain of sand. Or grain of sand, grain of salt. Treat everything with a grain of salt, and like do your homework, right? I'm never once advocating for like you to ignore realities. Like keep all of that in mind always. But you can still talk to them,
100%.
They can sometimes provide comps. And if you, if you can't, go get your own realtor, right? Like that's why you can work with someone yourself, and pay them yourself if you want really accurate data that's not going to be biased towards what that person's asking for, or you can look at it yourself. Go to LoopNet and see what's available, see what's sold recently, like, get the data that way. So lots of ways to do it.
I love that.
Protect your neck.
Protect your neck. Well, yeah, I think, and so it could be easy to potentially assume that we're being maybe a little bit pessimistic, but there's a great book called The Speed of Trust, and in that book there's a diagram that I think is really, really helpful, because what we're talking about is not being suspicious of these realtors because somebody else pays their paycheck. What we're talking about is what they call in the book smart trust. So blind trust is, the commercial realtor said this, it must be true. I won't do any due diligence. I won't do any checking. I won't verify. I'll just blindly trust. That's not what we're talking about. We're also not saying be suspicious of every person because every single person's out to get you. I'm not saying that. I would say, and I think, Maxwell, your experiences are similar. There are some people who are sharks. And also there's some good people. And to navigate that, smart trust, where it's not that we're assuming everybody's lying to us, but we're going to listen to what they have to say, take it with a grain of salt, like you said, or a grain of sand, whatever. And
like sand through the hourglass, so are the landlords of our lives.
And then do your homework.
Yeah.
I say the same exact thing. We're talking about commercial realtors today, but I say the same thing when it comes to bookkeeping, accounting, this kind of stuff.
Consultants.
What's that?
Even us, right?
Even us. I know. I literally filmed an Instagram reel today, and I said exactly that. Even us, don't blindly trust us, because at the end of the day, it's still your business.
Yep.
And guess who's not going to lose sleep over the advice they give you? The realtor or your bookkeeper, or some of them might, but in general, the people who are in those positions to give advice it's not their business. They're not going to lose a ton of sleep. It's not that they're trying to give you bad information, but at the end of the day, you are ultimately on the hook for who you listen to, what you do with that information. And anything that we, do or say, take it with a grain of salt, and don't just blindly trust us.
Yep.
That smart trust, because at the end of the day, it's still your business. At the end of the day, you have to be at peace with how you've decided to run things. And if you've implemented something poorly, you can't say, I heard, this bookkeeper say this, so I just did it. Well, you're on the hook for the consequences of those decisions.
I mean, you can say that, but maybe your staff won't trust you after that. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of trust, great way to lose trust is to blame other people all the time. Pro tip.
If you want to lose trust,
trust real fast, blame other people and don't take responsibility.
Yeah.
Even if it's not your fault per se, I find it tremendously helpful to differentiate between fault and responsibility.
Yep.
It almost doesn't even matter whose fault it is.
Yeah.
It matters whose responsibility it is. And if you're the owner, I'm not going to say it's your fault. I also it's almost a moot point.
Yeah.
What I will say is it may not be your fault. It could be 100% not your fault.
Yep.
But it can be 100% your responsibility.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty important distinction, I think, to make. Because otherwise, if we say it's your responsibility, it can sound like I'm saying it's your fault. And that's not at all what I mean.
No, not at all. But in the same way that, like a war, that some other person declares against your country isn't necessarily the fault of like a sitting president or something. That doesn't mean it's not their responsibility to deal with it. Yeah. That's in a lot of ways, leadership is having the responsibility of dealing with things that, are outside of your control and leading well in that.
Yeah. Being willing to take responsibility even when it's not
Yep.
our fault is, I think, one of the hallmarks of an effective leader.
Yep.
So, switching gears a little bit, talking about overhead and more specifically labor, this is a dimension where that distinction between fault and responsibility is incredibly important, because sometimes, especially with labor, it is also our fault.
Yeah.
We made a bad hire, we made a bad decision, or even if we didn't make the hiring decision, we're not making the firing decision, or we're not making scheduling decisions that effectively manage labor. One of the most heartbreaking things I see, and I still see it on a pretty regular basis, is when owners have kind of mentally, they've framed labor as something that's totally out of their control.
Yeah.
And that breaks my heart just from a philosophical standpoint. That's like such a disempowering place to be. But also, it's a little bit like the pilot of a plane taking their hands off the controls and be like, oh, it's outside of my control. It's like, actually, it's totally inside your control. And furthermore, that's your job. You're the pilot. Get your hands back on those controls.
Like, yes, there is a storm. Still your responsibility to navigate it.
Yeah. Again, that's the storm is not your fault, but is it your responsibility to navigate it? 100%. How, when you were at the helm of Narrative, how did you navigate the labor conversation? You've sent me some really eloquent texts about this topic, and I think of them often. But there's so many different ways to conceptualize it. How did you think about it? How did you manage it in a way that you actually took great care of people, maybe even better care than the average coffee shop of people?
Well, I hope so. To me, labor is like, for I think most people listening, I'm sure that you view it the same way that I do, but it's a responsibility, not just to you, but to people and their livelihoods and their families and their well-being. And it's easily the most, like, the heaviest thing that a business owner really has to do. It's a new level of responsibility that I think a lot of people, at least I didn't quite realize just how heavy it would feel. I suspected that it would, and it still didn't quite accurately capture the amount of responsibility that you feel for somebody.
100%. And also, if you're listening to this and you do not have employees and you are not responsible for labor, can I just say, you probably don't understand.
Yeah.
Because this used to be me, right? Do
you have employees now, Michael?
What? That's so weird.
It's me.
Yeah, it's me. But for real, I was guilty of this long ago when I was an employee of a coffee company. So, but I don't think staff members. This is me speaking from experience, as far as like my personal previous experience. I genuinely don't think staff members realize how little they understand of the weight, the burden, the responsibility. It's not to say that anybody is unintelligent or anything. I'm trying to poke at the reality of, there are certain things that if you haven't had those experiences, it's very difficult to communicate in words how much that can weigh.
Yeah.
And I'm only aware of it enough to know that I was not aware of it before.
Yeah, totally.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
To me, it's like having kids.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things where it's, you just don't know until you know. It's like, it's kind of like grieving, it's like if you've lost someone close to you, like you just, it changes you. It just does. Yep. And, people come out of like the woodwork in your life all of a sudden of people who have also gone through that, and they will be there for you. It's kind of like riding a motorcycle, which is a very much less serious thing, but like there's like this culture among motorcycles where if you're on a motorcycle, every motorcyclist waves to every other motorcyclist on the road. And it's like, you don't sign up with like a thing that says, I will wave to every motorcyclist as I pass them, when you get your permit or, or whatever, but it just happens. And I think it's like this almost unspoken thing amongst the culture of motorcycle riders of like, hey, it's us out in this world full of giant steel boxes that are moving at 70 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And our fleshy bodies are up next to them at any given point in time. It's all of us sticking together, and like, that's just sort of like the feeling that you get of like, we're in this together kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so it is like that, for people being business owners and being employers, especially. Like, and I think that's such a big distinction. And I try to make that for people is like, I'll talk to people who are like, oh, I'm a small business owner. It's like, I mean, yeah, you are, but you're not an employer. Yeah. And that's a fundamentally different thing. Being an employer is a very different thing than being in business for yourself. And so, it's like, it's just a different weight. And I think a lot of people just don't realize it because they just don't know. Yeah. So all that said, if you're there, I feel you. Yeah. And I know, especially because people in specialty coffee, generally speaking, tend to really want to do this because they care. Yep. And so it's like this particular 100%. Topic is really challenging because of the weight, and it is so huge. It's not, for most of us, like, people are not a number. People are people. Like, we know their lives. We know who they're, dating or not, or who they live with, or what's going on in their worlds. And most of us care deeply. And so, when we're talking about labor and we end up using percentages and those sorts of things, it doesn't quite capture the complexity of the situation. Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to just first and foremost acknowledge that for everybody. Yeah. And if we make recommendations on these kinds of things, we're not making them unaware of that context. Sure. Right? Like, it comes with a weight of knowledge and experience of having, those kinds of things weigh on us as well. So anyway, all that to say, for me, my hiring philosophy and my staffing philosophy is a give and take, right? My goal is to always try to live up to the expectations and to clarify those expectations really well up front, but then to follow through with those expectations from a staffing standpoint the best I can. Because again, the source of all conflict is unmet expectations. And so my goal from even before we start, like before we hire someone, even just in advertising a job, is to be very clear about what the expectations are of, here's how many hours this position we're looking to have. Here is, the pay that we can offer. Here are the benefits that we can offer, and those kinds of things. And I try not to ever promise more than I know I can deliver on. Yeah. As a general philosophy. Yep. Now, what I'm not saying is that there are no circumstances in which I would have to break those expectations, because that does happen. And you get the economy collapsing around you, and you have to make some hard decisions, right? And all those things are realities, and that's a really challenging part of being a business owner and being a leader in general, is having to make some hard decisions. So I also want to temper this a little bit by saying and reminding folks that at the end of the day, like, we are not responsible for everybody's entire well-being as owners, as business owners, as employers. Yeah. And there are some people who have tried to foist the expectation onto employers that they have to be all-encompassing and provide every detail for someone's life. It's like you have to care about their mental well-being and like their personhood and their retirement, and all these things. And it's like, that is a lot of responsibility, man. Like, at the end of the day, each person has to be responsible for themselves. Yeah. And if they're not making enough money in this particular position or something, they're going to have to make the decision to go find something else that takes care of them where they're at. Yeah. It's not your responsibility to give everyone as much money as they need to do the next thing in their life. Like, they might have to make a decision and find a new position for that as well. So all that to say, this is a tension. There's a tension here. Yep. Of being an employer, but generally speaking, my goal is to be as clear as possible, and I'm never trying to overpromise and underdeliver. That's always been my goal, is to never be that particular business owner. And that's a thing that people can sometimes get into, especially if they have a propensity for being really optimistic. If they're like the type of person who is overwhelmingly optimistic, they can sometimes set those expectations that aren't maybe as possible as they thought that they were. Yeah. So, in doing that, I always try to be really intentional with our scheduling, and it requires forecasting really well if you're going to try to do that, where you have to really try to understand exactly where your business is going to be. And a narrative, like we try to schedule a month in advance. So that means we're always playing a guessing game, and sometimes that means that you're off. And some days you'll be slightly overstaffed.
Yeah.
And some days you'll be slightly understaffed, because I always generally made a commitment that if I schedule you for these hours, you get these hours, and I try not to cut people from their shifts.
Yeah.
But it does mean sometimes sometimes you're getting the crap kicked out of you when you're on bar, and it's like, man, like it sure would be nice to have another person. And if I had the ability to have another person, I would. But it's not always possible. But I try not to send people home if I'm not more sure than not that they're going to have those hours.
Yeah.
So what that looks like in terms of commitments is, especially early on when you're first opening a place, it's like you kind of don't really know. So it's okay to take a closer view of like, hey, I'm only going to be able to get the schedule out 1 week at a time for I don't know, a month, and then I'll go to 2 weeks for a couple months, and then I'll go to 3. And you can step it out as you get more certainty of how business is going. That should also give you the ability to schedule out further and those kinds of things, which helps to manage expectations. But it really does look like having a really healthy understanding of your numbers, what each day looks like, staffing appropriately for those days, and then communicating with your staff on like, hey, like for example, Sundays are always contentious in most people's coffee bars. Like, they tend to be very busy days, and they're also a day that a lot of people really would like off. And so like communicating about like, hey, I need you to work Sundays, and that's like if you get hired here, you're going to be working Sundays. Having all of that sort of built in is all helpful in advance.
That's good, man.
I don't know if that answered your question. I just talked a lot, but
No, it's so good. Labor is probably one of the, in so many ways, it's one of the most complex topics. It's one of the ones that's most likely to be misunderstood, because anytime I even use the phrase managing labor, there's almost always just one extreme that pops into people's heads. Yeah. And that's one person described it as like grabbing people out of their seats on the airplane and tossing them out of the airplane without a parachute. I was like, holy crap. That's not at all what I mean, but I do understand like why somebody's mind would go there. When I say manage labor, I'm thinking of it in terms of this is how we sustainably and consistently take great care of people. If the plane, so to speak, gets so overloaded that the plane cannot hold that many people, that can crash the whole thing.
Yep.
On the flip side, though, going through a plane and tossing out people unnecessarily is like that's ruthless, and nobody would go on a plane like that.
Yeah.
If they had any other options.
Well, and I think like a lot of people, what they like when we're talking about this, we're generally trying to not talk about while the plane is in motion. It's like we're trying to balance before you get in the air. If we're doing our jobs well. Yeah. And sometimes you might realize, we've booked more people than can fit on this airplane. Yeah. And so, that can yield some conversation about other realities of like, part of doing right by people as much as you're able to is maybe help them find another job, ask connections. It's like most of us as business owners or as coffee bar managers or, whoever, we have relationships and connections that we've built over the years. And maybe we don't have a spot on our plane, but somebody else might. And if we can help connect them, then that can help make sure that person still has a plane to be on and it's going in the direction that they need it to go. But it can't always be our responsibility to carry every single person who needs a flight to that particular area. That can't be our responsibility. We have to ensure we are considering the well-being of our vehicle, and our plane moving and how many people it can fit, and being conscious of that.
I love what you were saying earlier about the job postings that you guys did at Narrative and trying to be as clear as possible in terms of expectations so that you don't overpromise and underdeliver. I have regularly used your Instagram posts, Narratives Instagram posts, as examples for clients.
Nice.
Because I think it's such a good example of setting clear expectations, but also actually just a great example of putting the word out. I am a little bit surprised at how often people are willing to complain they can't find like good candidates, but they're not telling anybody that they're even hiring. It's like how did you expect to find great people if you're not telling anybody that you are hiring? Yeah. So I was a little bit of a weird, like, where do you expect these people to come from?
Yeah.
If you're not telling anybody. If somebody is getting ready to open, what kind of parameters should they be keeping their eyes on to, decide when to hire their first person, decide how to staff accordingly so that there's sales to justify being open or sales to justify scheduling people? What are some rules of thumb? And again, going back to what you said, like, we're going to talk about numbers a little bit, but we don't want that to sound like we think that's all there is.
Yeah.
But also, a car has a speedometer for a reason.
Yep.
Is that the point of the whole thing? No, of course not. But it's there, and we use it to keep the people safe.
Yep.
You don't want to be going 120 when you should be going 35. That's what the speedometer is for. It's for safety. So what are some parameters, some numbers that you found helpful, or that you find yourself sharing with folks when they're talking about how to manage labor, especially if they're at the beginning? Like, they're not even open yet. They have no idea. So maybe it'll just be them for a couple days. But that's one of the most common questions I get is like, how do I know when I need to hire my first person?
Yeah. So usually there's a lot of work that goes in the preparation, like painting. If you've ever like painted much, you know that the vast majority of the work in painting really happens in the preparation, and the action of painting doesn't actually take that long compared to the overall scope of it.
My dad would give you a hug if he was a hugger right now.
Yeah.
Big time.
Thanks, Papa Ryan. I'm glad you're on the same page. But it's like the prep work is really where the bulk of that action takes place. And that's something that I've really tried, as we've been going through this small group cohort of how to start a cafe. That's something I've been reminding people of, is like, I'm going to ask you to do a lot of prep work here. And I understand that this might not feel directly connected.
Oh my gosh.
But I promise you, in the same way that Mr. Miyagi taught wax on, wax off, and then applied those things in the moment when you needed it, that's what we're doing here. I am setting you up for success down the line. I promise I am not telling you to do a single thing that I don't do myself, which looks like a lot of sanding and a lot of cleaning and wiping things down with appropriate
pressure
alcohol.
washing.
Yeah, exactly. Chipping up old paint. Anyway, so not to labor too much over that, but a little labor joke in there. But when you're starting a cafe for the first time, you have no clue. You are taking your best guess. And part of taking a really good guess is doing your homework and understanding what your overall location's capabilities are, what is most likely by doing good market research, and estimating your revenue. And so when you are coming back to figuring out, well, how many people do I hire? Well, how much revenue do you think you're going to be handling, right? And if you did your job well and all of that, then you can break that down and you take 30% of that revenue and then, break that down. Some of it's for taxes. So we're functionally taking closer to like 22% of that revenue. So let's say you're projecting, just for the ease of math, $1 million for this location. You're going to take 22% of that. That's $22,000. And you're going to divide that up into your labor costs. And so you're going to split that across. You need a good manager or like an assistant manager early on if you're going to take a management position. So you're going to allocate them, 40 hours a week, and then break the rest of that down into overall, hours per day, and so you can break that down and you backwards math into how many people you roughly need. And so you know how to hire appropriately for your first set of staff to match those needs. Right. So that's really what we're doing. I recommend hiring a manager. Manager should probably be the first person you hire. And then from there, you really need about 2 weeks, 3 weeks before you're ready to open is when you should start talking to hiring, or like get the job postings out there and be interviewing, because it takes people, like most of the staff that you're going to want are probably already gainfully employed, because that's why you're hiring them, is because they're going to be good, and they need at least 2 weeks to be able to put in their notice. And then you need, 3 solid, you could fully train a staff solidly in 3 days. It's better to have a little bit more time, but
Sure.
but it's possible to train a staff to be ready to rock in 3 days, and then continue on the job training. But so I would say 3 to 4 weeks before you're really ready to open is when you should be conducting interviews, going through that process, that kind of thing. Whenever I first opened Narrative in Everett, we hosted some group interviews, and this is one of my favorite conversations, and maybe we'll talk about it later. But we hosted some group interviews in the shop before the countertops were on. So it's like that's about the place where I started working at it. It was before the countertops were on, before the espresso machine was there.
I love it. Yeah, super smart. I have seen people hire way too early, and then a single delay, and they had to start paying paychecks before the shop was even open.
Yep, that's not good
because they were on the hook for. So yeah. Being super careful, being super intentional. Again, don't overpromise and underdeliver on something like that. The last question I had for you, kind of on this topic, I've heard different numbers of dollars per hour in sales, some kind of a dollars per hour per person, and I find that to be one of the most helpful numbers to have kind of floating around in your head, but also one of the most hotly disputed numbers.
Totally.
This is the number that when I say it, people just lose their minds and they're like, that can't be the number of dollars in sales we need per person per hour type thing.
Yeah. A lot of times that's because people are working from a place where their work has been inefficient.
Yeah.
Right. And so if a space is set up poorly, if people are not trained fully to be able to maximize their time, that number feels unachievable to people because their real world experience is highly inefficient.
Yeah.
Yeah. On the low end, 100 an hour per person. That's on the low end.
Yep. Yeah. We walk people through an exercise of how to do the math on that, to get like the specific number based on actual data. But before you have the actual information, 100 on the low end. I remember the first time I pitched that number to an owner, and I said 100, and they were like, let's do 60. And I was like, this is why your labor is 47%.
Yep.
That's like these things are connected to each other. This is not, I'm not just being, I'm not just being a goofball over here. The example that we use in small group coaching is for a real live example. But we, mathing it all out, it was $110 per hour per person.
Yeah.
And that's not, 100, 110, 120 ballpark in it, just to give people some sort of frame of reference. It's not $1,000 an hour per person, but it's not 60 per hour per person, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And having that kind of number in our heads, especially when it comes to like, should we even be open this late in the day? Well, we want to have 2 people for safety. Okay, well, that's $200 per hour because there's 2 people. Well, sales aren't there to be open past 1 p.m., 2 p.m. kind of thing. A really helpful way. If we keep it anchored around, this is how we sustainably and predictably take great care of people, I feel like that's such that's why I like the analogy of the airplane, because the whole goal is to create something that really does safely and predictably and consistently take great care of people.
Yeah.
And if that's the end game, managing labor is how we do that. So are we going to get the schedule out last minute, or are we going to start getting it out a week, 2 weeks, a month in advance?
Yeah.
Well, we want to take great care of people. So
advance is better.
A couple weeks in advance is how you take great care of people,
Yeah.
not these last minute schedules that erode trust.
Yeah.
That's all part of managing labor. And we didn't even get to publishing schedules really, because this can be a huge leak in the trust account.
Yes.
that owners, I think, underestimate, where they're losing the trust of their staff by publishing the schedule consistently last minute. But suffice to say, too many people on board the plane, too much inefficiency in how those people are deployed. These are some of the most common ways we see the body of the airplane, sort of get too big for the wings and the engines to carry safely and sustainably, and then the whole thing crashes.
Yeah.
So we really hope this conversation on overhead in general, rent and labor in particular, has been helpful. Keeping it always anchored around building a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people, And when we say manage labor, what we mean is keep it in check so that you have a number of people that you can actually take really great care of. Because if you can sustainably take care of 25 people, let's say, but you have 75, probably those 75 are not well taken care of. And so that's the tension we're trying to walk in light of. All right. I'm going to let you go. It's been great to be with you as always.
Yeah. Cheers. See you, bud.
Thank you for joining me today for my discussion with Maxwell Mooney. Please check out the links in the show note captions to follow Maxwell Mooney on Instagram at Maxwell Threadbare. You can also check out the interview he did with Upflip that has millions of views. They interviewed him while he still owned Narrative. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider subscribing on YouTube. That's a great zero-cost way to support this podcast. In addition, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple and Spotify. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. Please check out our online courses, our group coaching, and our one-on-one coaching. That's the absolute best way to support this podcast. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover or guests you'd like us to invite, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. If you're not already following us on social media, we are at Threadbare Coffee Consulting on Instagram, and that's really the only platform we're active on. That's where I regularly post bite-sized thoughts on what it will take you, the owner, to build a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people, including you. The content we post on Instagram overlaps with the podcast, but it's generally distinct from anything we cover on this podcast. If you haven't already visited our website, we have a myriad of free tools and trainings for coffee shop and coffee roastery owners. Everything from calculating your cost of goods sold for both a cafe and a roastery, which is completely different, pricing, which again for a cafe and roastery is completely different, managing labor percentage in a way that takes great care of people, etc., etc. All of those tools and trainings are available at our website, threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. And last but not least, thank you for your interest in building a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people, including you.